Hello, hello, hello. Doooovid here. I have a special guest, thanks to Yehuda Finkelstein setting this up, and Oswald in my Discord, Professor Edward Dutton, prolific author, anthropologist, streamer. I've actually been following his content for a few years, possibly controversial, might get into that, and I guess someone recommended that he speak to Reb Doooovid on one of his shows, and I tweeted out to him, and he agreed to come on my show. I've read through quite a bit of his literature, and obviously, in streaming debate circles, Professor Dutton is owner of a much bigger channel than mine and bigger audiences than mine. So I'm happy to have him on my channel. I guess I'll let Professor Dutton introduce himself. Let me just give a quick screen share to people who never heard of Professor Dutton. He's got his own Wikipedia page, his own web page. Here's on Amazon. Professor Dutton is author of well over 10 books on various topics, a lot of them related to intelligence or group difference and simple things like why people do things. And also an author of, oops, I didn't mean to close that, an author of well over 100 articles. So I'm sorry, fumbling here. I had, so academic articles on his page, over 100 of them on a whole bunch of interesting topics. And anyone who watches me regularly, I have my own theories, but I just love understanding, like the Richard Feynman book, The Joy of Figuring Things Out, the joy of understanding why things are. And your Church of Entropy, who hopefully is going to be showing up, you're just kind of like a Seinfeld approach, like why do people do what we do? People act in pretty weird ways. Professor Dutton also has a lot of book reviews, so I sometimes look at his book reviews. So I had pulled out a whole bunch of articles of Professor Dutton's on various topics, but let's let Professor Dutton introduce himself. And in some ways, it's an honor to have you on my channel, because it's an accomplished academic who's written many books and owner of a channel much larger than mine.
Oh well, no, thank you for having me on. And I remember when I had a very small channel myself, and it gets a lot bigger over time, it seems. But yeah, hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm Ed Dutton, and I'm I suppose an evolutionary psychologist, really. And I started off in theology. I did a theology degree. From there, I moved into the sort of anthropology field work to do with religion, and from there I moved into studying sort of culture, really, particularly Finnish culture, and from there I moved into understanding the genetics and the evolution of cultural differences and things like intelligence and personality and things like this, and religiousness and group differences in these from a evolutionary perspective. And really for the last sort of 7 years or so, that's been very much my focus, and I've written various books on this and related topics. My first book was Meeting Jesus at University, and most of them, not the Islam one because they banned that, are available on Amazon, but you have to go into Amazon Books to get them. I think it might be shadow banned on the American Amazon. So yeah, so that's what I research. And then I have a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic, which is where I live stream. I do videos once a fortnight or so on various academic topics, and I live stream on there twice a week. And yeah, so that's what I do. And one of the big supporters of my channel, who regularly sends in super chats and whatever, Yehuda Finkelstein, suggested that I get in touch with this gentleman, and so I have a chat, and so I was happy to do so.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. And as I mentioned, I know Finkelsteins. I had a Rabbi Finkelstein in Jerusalem and prayed. There's a Rabbi Finkelstein in Amunas Yisrael in Brooklyn. There's probably Finkelsteins here in Detroit, but it's not coming offhand. So I have no idea whether I know this person or not, but appreciate setting him up, setting this interview up, because in many ways, you're the different approach, counter approach, and we're doing the same thing, which is social commentary. But I'm a pattern thinker, chess coach, advancing some of my own theories on consciousness that just likes to understand why people do things, and I accept largely that there's folly in that the nature of man draws people to act in mistaken behaviors. I mean, you mentioned you had a theological background and then went more scientific. I don't know if you're a dualist or if you're, because I would consider myself a scientist who could express things in a material scientific nature, but in belief, I personally believe that there are forces coming from some sort of spiritual realm that cause these effects, not purely material. But it seems, at least in your works, that you're within the realm of empirical science.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in recent years is the decline of academia and what underpins the decline of academia. And one of the things that I've argued underpins the decline of academia is a devaluing in the importance of truth. And that a lot of these academic institutions were founded as religious institutions, and there was a fundamental belief that the purpose of an academic, what Sir Isaac Newton would have regarded as his purpose as a scientist, is to reveal more about God's revelation, the nature of God's revelation, and therefore to lie, to not tell the truth, would be kind of like blasphemy. And there were some people that thought that was so important that for religious reasons they were prepared to, go to the stake, rather than, as they saw it, lie about God's revelation. So there was this fundamental belief in the importance of truth, and what that was undergirded by was a belief in something transcendental, something metaphysical, some idea of truth as eternal, and as something eternal and unquestionable that underpins truth as truth. So sort of a traditional worldview, really. And there were probably a few generations that were brought up in a religious society and were therefore inculcated with the importance of truth, but didn't believe in God. And so those people would still, it was just an unquestionable thing, a sort of an implicit religion almost in science, that you don't lie, you must tell the truth. And now we're not raised in a religious society, and that it could be argued that for that reason, that belief in the importance of truth has gone. And so when you think about scientists, particularly scientists who are quite controversial, why are you doing this? Why are you risking social opprobrium? Why are you risking, being thrown off social platforms? Why are you risking these things for truth? Why are you doing this? Why is truth so important? Then there must be a degree to which, there may be a degree to which for such a person, almost like an implicit religion is truth. It's almost like truth is some godlike thing for them. And that raises the question of what makes truth truth. So I do think there can be a religious dimension to science. In some ways, I'd rather my scientists believed in God and believed they'd be damned to hell for lying, because then I could be more confident that they wouldn't just manipulate their results to gain social favor.
Yeah, well, I meant even on a more metaphysical level, because generally I reject evolution, even though I'm not a doctor, but I went to university and can function in a world where evolution is the dominant theory. And then even to a level of whether your theories are neutral on the hard problem of consciousness, and saying that people have these desires and drives because religion is true, because God is true, because there are spiritual forces. And in a I don't know if you have a Calvinist Lutheran background, but you just say there's a nature to sin and act in an improper way, and maybe in a Freudian way of the Judeo concept of an evil inclination and a good inclination in some internal fight, versus an evolutionary framework that explains these concepts, versus an agreement, even if me and you completely disagree on those larger framing for cosmology, that we could agree on a recognized pattern, that there is such a pattern, and that you've correctly identified it. For example, the Flynn effect, your claim that humanity reached mass achievement in the 60s and 70s in larger causes, even if my own explanation is, yes, that pattern you're recognizing is right. However, the cause of it is in fact not something anthropological or evolutionary, but actually some forces from a material realm. But you're saying as an anthropologist, you would reject that and say evolutionary, there's just a reason why I believe that those forces exist, but in essence, they don't exist. They're not true.
I have a colleague, Bruce Charlton, who is a former professor of medicine, theoretical medicine, at the retired now at the University of Newcastle, and he increasingly sees what is happening in the world in this spiritual way, this sort of dualistic, Gnostic sort of fight between good and evil that is being played out in the world. But I think that as scientists, the idea is to, rather than just say God did it, is an attempt to find an empirical explanation as far as possible, to work out empirically and without the need to draw upon a deus ex machina what has actually happened and what has actually taken place. So that would be my inclination when confronted with something that's occurred, to try and work out scientifically what might be going on. For example, if you look at something like the Exodus account and the account of the plagues in Egypt and the Jewish escape from Egypt and that sort of thing, there have been various attempts to work out what happened. Now, some of those scientific theorizings as to what occurred are a bit far-fetched. Things like planets crashing into each other and going out of orbit and whatever. But at least it's an attempt to work out what's happened from an empirical perspective. And that's the essence of science, that you assume that the only world is the world of the material. And you work out your theories from there. Now, I'm not saying that I'm completely closed-minded to possibilities of there being some other, dualism or whatever, and I'm aware the whole area of parapsychology attempts to look into this, and there are various unsolved enigmas there, which I suppose may reflect the limitations of our empirical knowledge, or may reflect other things. But my approach would be empirical, and would be to try to understand what has gone on from a materialist perspective.
Yeah, I guess if you don't mind, maybe I'll ask you a few more questions along this line before your specific work, because I think this outlook is kind of important. And I love Freemasonic literature. I talk about I'm not an initiated Freemason, but I largely accept the Masonic framework. And if you ask what was, anthropology before anthropology became, who historically did anthropology, it was largely Freemasons. And even before that, like Muslims who categorized Hindu society, and explorers, Herodotus, and the famous writers who largely had a concept that there were extra spiritual, non-material forces that were behind the group actions of people. If you're talking like evolutionary psychology, or you had your articles regarding Kevin MacDonald's group evolutionary theory of Judaism and Nathan Kaufman's, but from the ancient perspective, that there was some sort of non-material force that caused that. And even if, what I'm saying, let's say a person's looked and they read your research and say, yes, that pattern seems to be scientifically true, but what is the motivating factor that causes man to act in that way? And from a scientific view, is saying science is just the process of using a method that's bound to a form of rationality that doesn't necessarily have to include materialism. So the pushback that I would be giving to you is that is there conclusive evidence that these motivations derive from the material realm, and could it be scientific to exhibit a theory to explain these known patterns with forces that derive from a non-material realm?
It's a very difficult question. One understanding of science is to say no. By definition, science involves is materialistic, is monist, and involves using empirical evidence or theoretical, whatever evidence, to understand the empirical realm. And so you can't. So no. That would be the answer that occurs most obviously to me. Also, what you said about the Freemasons, I understand that by the early 19th century, about 5% of the male population of some Western countries were members of the Freemasons. And it would have, of course, the membership would have been heavily overrepresented. It would have been a sort of upper class grouping. So the two sort of cross over. It's a social club for members of the upper class, and those people are also going to be overrepresented in science and scientific discovery. And so it's a sort of a correlation without necessarily a causation. I mean, the Duke of Edinburgh was asked to be in the Freemasons and was in it for a while and dropped out because he thought it was silly. Various very, very senior politicians in the UK, all of them used to be in the Freemasons. Winston Churchill was a Freemason. Lots and lots of very prominent people are Freemasons. And then they also go on to do other things. So
specifically anthropology, that the most famous people that categorized and wrote in detail descriptions of other cultures that would be considered anthropology today were basically Freemasons.
Well, I'm not familiar with the influence of Freemasonry over anthropology. I can't comment on that.
Anthropology is a new science, but I just meant the concept of what you do today. Who did did it not exist hundreds of years ago, or it existed under a spiritual rubric of?
You could argue that it exists. Well, I'm not really an anthropologist much these days. I'm more a sort of evolutionary psychologist. But when I did things like field work and that sort of stuff, then you could argue that it was formalized, that what anthropology as a discipline became formalized in the mid to late 19th century with people like Sir James Fraser and Bronislaw Malinowski and people like that. It became formalized, and before that you had a sort of informal thing that wasn't a formalized academic subject, where you would have people that would go to foreign countries and make copious notes and spend a great deal of time there and integrate with the culture and learn the language and learn a great deal about them and then report back. And you could argue, therefore, that there was a sort of proto-anthropology at various points in history, including in the ancient world, where people would do things like that. But it just wasn't formalized into an academic subject within the academy in the same way that it subsequently became.
And so at some point in your, let's say, quest to understand how the world works or knowledge, you turn to evolutionary psychology as being more explanatory. And I've looked at some of your articles on so to say, the soft science and trying to formalize the soft science, but and we've both been on JF, and actually Church of Entropy. Jennifer just messaged me. Hopefully she'll be here any minute. But that genetics and group psychology, group genetics, is a better, more scientific explanation to explain these phenomenons than anthropological perspective, or is just a career, like an intellectual trajectory that of your discovering higher levels of truth, or just the random career other factors?
Well, it was that as someone that did at quite a young age in British schools. I don't know about in America, but in Britain, you end up dividing really between whether you're a humanities person and you're a science person. And indeed, the evidence is that those people have two markedly different kinds of personality as well. Those that are attracted to the humanities and those that are attracted to the sciences. And I was always more interested at that stage in the humanities, and so I ended up you had to do your A levels, and so which was chose at 16, and so I did English, history, and Christian theology. And then you had to do a degree, which realistically had to be one of your A levels, or at least if it was all humanities, it had to be humanities or social science degree. And I did theology, and in that I really liked religious studies. So it was the attempt to scientifically understand religion. But it wasn't so scientific in the sense that it was entirely or almost entirely based around environmentalist assumptions. All of the explanations that we were given for religion, all of the theories that we looked at were completely and exclusively based around environmentalist assumptions. And you get that now. That divide is very, very conspicuous between the humanities and social science departments, or humanities departments particularly, and science departments. There's a total assumption that everything is to do with environment in history or in these humanities type subjects. There's no engagement with genetic factors, and that's a very serious problem. Because as I read into it, I realized that a substantial component of what explains differences in religiousness is genetic. And so if you want to understand why one person is more religious than another, then what I had always previously assumed as a person educated in the humanities department was it's all just to do with environmental factors, stress, things like that, at times of change, you become more religious, so this sort of thing. And the idea that you would look into certain personality types, with personality being about 50% to do with genes, or intelligence, which is about 0.8 to do with genes, or religiosity itself as a factor, which is highly heritable. I mean, fundamentalist religiosity is about almost 0.7 heritable. It just wasn't there. And so as I discovered this sort of stuff, then I started to see things from a different perspective, and it made sense, particularly in my undergraduate fieldwork, which I did with fundamentalist Christian students. That psychological dimension and that genetic dimension made sense of things and answered questions in a way that the other theories just didn't do. It was just a more parsimonious explanation for the kinds of differences that I was observing. And so, for example, why is it that conversion experience, religious experience, was higher at Oxford? More people at Oxford University Christian Union had converted to Christianity and had dramatic conversion experiences and become Christians while they were there at Oxford than was the case at, let's say, Aberdeen, where I did field work, or a place in the Netherlands where I did field work. Now, I put the answer down to the transformative nature of the university. The University of Oxford is more liminal. It questions your identity to a greater extent. This makes you stressed. This makes you want structure. And so you have a religious experience. And that may be partly true. But on the other hand, the kinds of personality traits which predict being more religious, which will also predict having a religious experience, also predict doing better at school, just doing better academically, and therefore getting into Oxford. So that's also going to be relevant, that the kind of personality traits to predict doing very well academically are going to also predict potentially being religious, and in one case with having dramatic conversion experiences as well, because that's associated with neuroticism, and an optimum relatively high level of neuroticism, which is mental instability, is associated with doing well at university. So that made a lot more sense of it, I think, than simply saying, oh, well, the University of Oxford is a bit different and a bit more transformative for students who are lower middle class or something like that. So there was that sort of thing that gradually that got me thinking about, I'd done research on Finland and Finnish culture, and it got me thinking about that and how understanding genetics and evolution made a great deal of sense of why the Finns are different from the English, let's say. Up until that point, I'd always put it down to environmental factors and things like that. But the thing is that if the differences are constant, if the differences don't change, if they are there constant over time and immutable to environmental interventions, it's much more likely to be a genetic issue. And so it made more sense of that. And so then from there, I started to realize that this was the means by which you could make a great deal of sense of the world. And so I became much more interested in it.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I guess Jennifer showed up, and we've been streaming for about 2 years now, Sunday nights, and our interest is more cognitive science, consciousness, quantum mind, possibly related to your Oxford study. Both of us, she might express it differently, biographically, but became Hindus in university. That whatever the university experience would be, that it would transform us into, so to say, Hindus. And I'm advancing what I call the multiple truth hypothesis. Jennifer likes to call meta-analysis or backgrounds mathematics and physics. And I'm not sure if you've tried to put your theories into like formal mathematical logic or kind of like economics, if they could eventually be reduced even to differential equations. And if you looked at from like a cognitive level, if like the initiation process of going to university, accepting some sort of higher system or joining a club, however it's defined, in the process, and then a cultural comparison to say, what's the difference between an Anglo person in Europe going to Oxford and becoming more into their Christianity versus me and Jennifer going to state universities in the US and Canada and becoming interested in Hinduism, versus the experience like I think actually a lot of people convert to Islam in university or various things, but to universalize from the anthropological science to universalize some sort of process. I used to debate. I mean, you're also somewhat infamous, as a proponent of what your critics would call racial science or racial understanding, which is pretty unpopular in Western universities. And you say if there's a universal brotherhood of man, and there's certain processes that are universal to all people, and it could be that there's inclinations and boundary conditions based on genetics. And, if you could formalize that, envision like a series of differential equations that would have a bounded condition based on genetics with a factor of environment. And like the chess studies that have showed largely that mastery requires 10,000 hours of work, and that over a period of time, some people might reach mastery over 3,000 or 4,000 hours, but generally IQ becomes less predictive.
My understanding, if you're talking about the 10,000-hour rule, is that it's been comprehensively refuted, and that even the person that came up with it has admitted that it was nonsense.
Well, it was Chase and Simon 1971 chess study, and yeah, as like a heuristic, as a scientific rule, but the studies that have demonstrated that below average intelligent people could reach chess mastery, and also some counterfactual studies that showed chess players are higher IQ in general, but the very best chess players tend to have lower IQs than so to say the club.
That's interesting, because there was some research on genius by Hans Eysenck, and I should note that it's been kind of disputed. But what he argued was that above a certain level of IQ, he put it at 120, but it may be higher, IQ ceases to become important in terms of predicting creative success. So a certain level of IQ is necessary, above average IQ is necessary for creative success, for coming up with something original and brilliant. But it's a necessary component, but more is needed. And a lot of the research into genius, I've looked at this in my book, The Genius Famine, indicates that the genius combines outlier high IQ with sort of a certain kind of personality, moderately antisocial personality, actually, and that this makes them more creative, because if they're low in conscientiousness, low in impulse control, low in rule following, really, then they can think outside the box. They can sort of make these connections which other people might not make. And if they're low in agreeableness, then they've kind of got a killer instinct. New ideas always offend people, but they won't really care about that, and they'll just present their new idea. Or they might be so autistic they don't really realize they'll offend people, and so they go for it anyway. And then there's some indication that it's that, and those people might not have the best IQ. Indeed, it's been found that when people have very high IQ, then the positive manifold between the different components of IQ, linguistic, spatial, verbal, breaks up. And so they could be very, very high in G and very high in a particular component of IQ, but much lower in others, which would mean that overall their IQ might not be that high. So, for example, Watson, who was one of the co-discoverers of DNA, I think he estimated his IQ was it had been tested at sort of 125 or something, which is, I mean, it's high. I mean, it's a high IQ, but it's not in the sort of outstanding IQ range. I remember there was an interview with a chap called Michael Persinger, and he researches the neuropsychology of religion. He's Canadian, works at Canadian University, and he found that his experience was that the ones that would do well in his area, they might not have the best grades at university, but they were creative. And so what you're saying about chess, I think, is potentially consistent with that you would, up to a point, IQ is going to predict doing well in chess, but also to the extent that it's a cognitive test, but it's also a test of creativity I would imagine to a certain degree, to being able to cut. You've got to think of a move which is an unusual, unpredictable move, so be creative, and that would be IQ plus something else, and so therefore the very best people might not actually have the very best IQ. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I've been going over all of these studies, and chess happens to be probably the most studied cognitive factor in terms of thought, and especially because it has a somewhat objective rating system where you could tell a person's skill level, and that has been memorialized over time, so you could compare 100 years ago, and the counterintuitive that Alfred Binet himself assumed that chess excellence was purely related to IQ. And there's actually detailed studies about the relationship of nature and nurture, what points and skill level, to say different people that had different methods at different times in their life, and an outcome to say, IQ still might be the most determinative factor, but in terms of somewhat like a scientific estimation of effort versus talent, that at some point the tortoise can overrun the hare, and it's actually a simple process that could be calculated. And chess is something that's been very well understood and analyzed. If you compared coronavirus and maybe things like social distancing and wearing a mask in science education, that I'd mentioned theories of the Chinese supposedly have high IQ of 105, and you mentioned the impulse control being related to IQ, and just a simple factor, social distancing is difficult, and the larger factor in probably being able to keep social distance is just my philosophization, not based on a study, is probably impulse control, and maybe China and those areas that are having better success with beating COVID-19 is related to impulse control versus like
they're extremely obedient. The Finns are as well. They're very, very conformist. It's
almost
with
high IQ, but saying like Iran.
High IQ, but you haven't got these people without. That's another thing. You haven't got these people with outlier high IQ. So the IQ of the East Asians is higher than that of Europeans, but it's bunched. And so these people that have outlier high IQ, that seems to very high. That seems to correlate with autistic traits, and thus with being a bit uncooperative and things like that. But they don't have many per capita people like that, and also they don't have many per capita sort of psychopathic sort of people. The genius type is an outlier high IQ plus moderately high sort of psychopathic traits combined, and they just, that combination, which is going to question the status quo and say, we shouldn't wear masks, or we shouldn't, question is almost inclined to question whatever is the norm. Those kinds of people are a much smaller percentage of the population, I think, than would be the case in Western countries, even if they had the same IQ. And so they're not there, and so therefore they're able to impose this blanket thing. In Finland, I think you see it as well to a less pronounced degree. The IQ in Finland, as far as I can see, is about 3 points higher than that of other European, than 100 of the British standard. But it's bunched, so you don't have these outliers at either end, which means you don't have the high IQ psychopathic types questioning things, and you don't have the low IQ psychopathic types doing stupid things. And this is one factor, which may relate to it. Another is the nature of the personality. The people, the Chinese and the Finns, are shy. They're not extrovert. They don't touch each other and hug each other, and the sense of social distance is bigger. Your personal space is larger, and there's all these other factors which I think, and people live to a certain degree quite far apart, and so there's all these other factors which will help it not to spread. But I mean, this coronavirus is going on, and where I live in northern Finland, you just wouldn't know about it. You wouldn't. It's really very limited, the impact on your everyday life, really very limited indeed. I can go to the pub, I can go to the only thing is the pub's shut 2 hours earlier than normal. They shut at midnight rather than 2 o'clock in the morning. But there's no mask wearing is a very much a minority sport, and it's just not hit in here.
But related to the chess studies, I was thinking of that in terms of putting together complicated cognitive ideas like Freud and his Civilization and Discontent. And in order to live together in society, people have to understand complex cognitive things, and especially for things like social distancing and beating coronavirus. And it's been well tested, for example, that exponential growth is a complicated concept. I'm not sure if they have like IQ differentials, but I think they do. And even it's estimated that the minority of people in America understand exponential growth, and these various factors that might make it more difficult for people to understand what's going on, why are we behaving the way we're behaving, versus, like, okay, just a dictator who's going to beat people into submission doesn't really work. I mean, it's not just like, you could have an authoritarian personality who's going to beat people into submission. There has to be some sort of underlying intelligence, like in Chinese society, that would allow him to. But that's just the general direction. Brundle, one of these longtime alt-right former streamer, we'll see if he makes it back in this era. Super chat, appreciate that. Asking for our IQs. I'm not sure. I was tested at 12 years old, and I scored a 128. As a child, and that was enough to allow me to gain entrance to the school set up by the students of Freud here in Michigan, where supposedly it was like a 130, although there might have been testing irregularities, and I was a chess champion. So they might have mistakenly thought that I was smarter than I was because I was a chess champion, even though the evidence. But I did get a fifth. I did do pretty good on tests, and I've always been successful academically. I'm not sure if Jennifer wants to disclose that or say that, but or if Ed, or if you want to discuss maybe your aspect on your racial differences and what's the difference between, so to say, the universal brotherhood of man and universal factors that determine cognitive and behavioral processes for all people, and the obvious differences that are demonstrated that different people have different propensities to act in different ways, in kind of like the nature versus nurture debate. And if you want to add IQ into that, feel free.
Yeah, so if you could just answer those 10 questions in list form, that'd be great.
No notes. We're talking high IQ here. No notes are needed.
Anyway, it's really great to meet you, Dr. Dutton.
What do you want me to talk about? What's the question?
I just wanted to say it's really nice to meet you, but the audience member asked for your IQ, so maybe start with that.
No, I'm not going to do. I've already said that publicly, and I'm not going to do it again. It's a bit like someone asking how big your cock is, isn't it? I mean, I don't know why people insist on asking that. So,
well, I think it's related to. I mean, me and Jennifer talk oftenly on our debate, of the question of free will and the question of determinism. And if the studies show that behavior is related to IQ, it's a question of determinism, it's a question of free will. And then, God forbid, from like a Jewish perspective of like my training, these teachings were thought to be dangerous. They were thought to be related to eugenics and the Holocaust, and dangerous, so much so that like University of Michigan doesn't really present studies like these, even though the science. I don't know,
because I mean the thing is that the Nazis weren't that people make this mistake. The Nazis weren't particularly interested in IQ. They had the conception of people that are very, very retarded, that they shouldn't have children and all this sort of thing. But that wasn't just the Nazis. That was common everywhere. Sweden had policies like that. States in America had policies like that.
Well, I'm the one who's interested in IQ. I was just saying like that, but I meant the racial difference that the studies.
The Nazis. Well, I mean, on the other hand, you can say that there are dangers to playing up racial differences and whatever, but there are also dangers to playing them down. So a good example would be something like. If we say that there are no racial differences and they don't exist, and race is just an environmental construct, then, well, it shouldn't matter if you need a kidney transplant if you, as a white person, get a kidney from a South Asian and vice versa. But it does matter. It does matter, because you are more likely to reject the organ if it is from somebody who is significantly genetically similar to you, and you're more likely to accept it if it's from somebody who is genetically similar to you. And that's why they have, in the British National Health Service, they have to advertise for South Asian organ donors, very specific, and black organ donors, because they do not donate their organs very much compared to white people. And so there's this excess of white organs, well, not excess, but there's more per capita white organs than there are of these other races, and it's a problem. Now, if you're going to say race doesn't exist, then you're not going to try to encourage South Asians or black people to donate their organs more, because there's no difference. And then people who have organ failure who are South Asian or black are more likely to die. So there's clearly negative consequences to rejecting this scientific fact, which is that there are these groups, that have been separated in evolution and vary in the frequency of alleles. That's a risky thing to do, and it has bad consequences. I mean, even in the administration of certain medicines, some races literally need a higher dose than others. Or it was found in Sweden that to remain healthy, Somalis living in Sweden must take double the vitamin D supplement that Swedes take. Why? Because the Somalis have dark skin and are less able to absorb sunlight and ultraviolet light and synthesize this into vitamin D because of their dark skin, which is a racial issue. It's a matter of genetics, involve adaptation to different environments. So there are dangers to not talking about race. And that's why I think we have this schizophrenic attitude towards race, where on the one hand, the National Health Service will employ an equality advisor at great expense when they should be spending that money on doctors and nurses and things that matter. But on the other hand, we'll have to put up adverts saying, look, please, we need more people who are South Asian or black to donate their organs. There are dangers the other way.
Well, there's, in the US and probably all over the world, the policy implications of these things are huge. And I'm most famous for my internet presence, largely defending the Jewish role in multiculturalism and immigration. And, those are two big examples of theories that have a big impact. The divisure in America is somewhat based on the remnants of these integration, segregation issues, and the question of group difference. And, just like Freud, civilization and its discontent, Freud's civilization and its discontent presumably would apply even if there weren't group differences. You would still have all of the issues in Freud's civilization and its discontent, but added with group differences. And then, as I mentioned, I was in University of Michigan when Richard Spencer was supposed to speak there. That's the only time in my life I saw a student walk out, mass protest. Like the majority of the student body stopped and got out of classes and was like, we're not going to, like university, we can't let this guy speak. And there might have been added issues. And I say, like, at the visceral issues, it comes down to issues like immigration, criminal reform, but the scientific basis, and the author of the Bell Curve did speak at University of Michigan and was heckled, and it's on YouTube. But so to say, these ideas have implication at the ballot box. They have implications in policy, and they're also just a question from Doooovid's cognitive point of view of what patterns are true in the nature of science. And even if there is a truth,
that's the issue that we have to divorce. That what science is about is
just let me finish for 1 second. That whatever the truth is, people need to put patterns together in their own head to understand the world. And like Mark Zuckerberg says, people get things wrong. Things are complicated, and any given person is going to go through some sort of process trying to understand things, ciphering the information, as mentioned, the chess or skill levels or IQ studies, however you understand it. And even if racism, let's say, is wrong scientifically, that as a pattern, people might still choose to think that pattern makes sense. Or if the pattern of equality and the larger principles ruling American urban areas that are largely, so to say, implemented from society upon people. And me and Jennifer would phrase it in the term of the cognitive dissonance, because the pattern that we're taught, we either have in our head genetically or through our own free will, or have been taught, like cultural shock. And I still have all these papers, like you've even done studies on these things that give it a term I never even heard of, like cultural shock. But me and Jennifer usually put in the term of cognitive dissonance, and just like whatever the pattern is, whether it's going to cause a person dissonance and they're going to have to react to it in a certain way. And that could largely be understood scientifically through, the fields that you're an expert in, although it's highly controversial because if you're right or you're wrong has huge implications for society. And then even I mentioned back the question of free will, that you could be right or wrong, and it could be fated. Just because you're right, it could be fated in a certain way that, just because you figured it out doesn't mean that humanity could change the course that we're on, because there's larger forces that are understanding these forces can't stop them.
Yeah, I don't think it's relevant to science. Science is about understanding the world and understanding the nature of the world. And what people that's it. That's all it's about. I had this debate at the moment with this transsexual who I presented a study in which I argued that transsexuality is associated with masculinization. And I looked at how that works. I looked at why a masculinized brain seems to mediate the relationship between certain kinds of people and transsexuality. And that person argued that that study, my study, has the potential to harm already marginalized people. And I said, well, no, that argument has no place in science. A, because it's an appeal to consequences. So the fact that it has the potential, in your view, to harm people is of no relevance to whether or not it's the most accurate understanding of the data. And B, it's an appeal to emotion. It's manipulative because you refer to them as already marginalized. You're trying to evoke sympathy for them and trying to basically get me to shut up and not present the most parsimonious view, understanding of the data as I see it through emotion. It's appeal to emotion, it's appeal to consequences, and it's totally unacceptable in science. My duty as a person engaged in this process, to the extent that I have one, is to present the findings and to present the most reasonable understanding of the findings. I don't see that I have any broader duty than that. And people that do think that, they put they're not scientists, they're not academics, they put something above the truth, such as empathy or people's feelings or power. They will often talk about the fact that they don't like it that a person who is a professor or who has credentials says this. Why? Oh, well, because it gives credibility. That's the word they use. It gives credibility to these racist views or whatever. You're like, no, that is irrelevant. Whether a person that says something has credentials or doesn't. It's either objectively true or it isn't. It's either the most parsimonious interpretation of the available data or it isn't. And the nature of who said it is irrelevant. And if you think it is relevant, then that is a fallacy and that is appeal to authority. And that's what they engage in all the time, because they're ultimately not, they're narcissists as far as I can see, or these Machiavellians. What they are focused on is power. For them, power is truth. Truth is power. Might is right. And the idea that there's an objective truth is irrelevant. What's relevant is power, the fact that they want power for themselves, and they see science as a kind of guild through which they can get power and through which they'll be powerful. And if they have that power, then other people will listen to them and their truth will be the truth, but there's no objective truth. And I completely disagree with that. I think there is clearly objective truth, and the purpose of science is to make sense of it and to further it. And there's no other purpose.
Could I ask a question, please, Doowovid?
Yeah, please. I keep on meaning to hand it over to Jennifer. This is my regular streaming partner, Church of Entropy. She's familiar with your work. She's been on the public space and probably debated or talking with some of your contemporaries.
Yeah, hi. It's really great to be able to talk to you, Dr. Dutton. I've followed, well, most of what I've seen you do is with Richard Spencer, and I think it's probably some of the more important conversations that are being had. So congratulations for moving the dial forward. I had a question about how scholastics understands anthropology, and I'm just wondering if you're familiar with something called the Aryan Invasion Theory.
Sorry?
Are you familiar with the Aryan Invasion Theory?
Aryan, yes, I am, yes.
So I'm just wondering what role this theory plays in modern academia's understanding of history, per se.
Just to help clarify this for Professor Dutton, one of Jennifer's a famous yoga instructor, and one of her main areas of debate is debunking
I don't
and
think
arguing.
it's a good idea to introduce me as a famous yoga instructor because I'm not really.
Okay, well, I apologize for that, but one of her main areas of debate is arguing against the Aryan invasion theory. For people unfamiliar watching that, the concept that there was a group of Aryans of questionable origin that well, there's different forms of Aryan invasion theory. That might be the theory that she's talking about, but that the Vedas in Indian culture and possibly European culture also was created by these Aryans. So that's one of her big issues. And I guess obviously, your talk on the Finns and the origins of people and racial differences. It's a question: where do we come from? What's the origin? And it seems that the Aryan Invasion Theory is false. However, it is still widely accepted in academia.
I'm not asking you to defend the theory, Dr. Dutton. Really, it was just
I don't defend it. I simply read about it. It interests me in terms of the settlement of Britain as a British person. So first, you have the hunter-gatherers, the Western hunter-gatherers that come to Britain, then or Europe for that matter, and then you have the Neolithic farmers, and then you have the Indo-Europeans. And there's these layers of settlement, and the Indo-Europeans were a slightly different culture and were more sort of culturally advanced, I suppose, than the Neolithic peoples, and so they displaced them. And you get the usual relationship that you seem to get whenever there's an invasion, which is that on the Y chromosome, it's the more dominant people that you will find, and so people will be descended from the Indo-Europeans, for example, on the Y chromosome, overwhelmingly in these kinds of places. But on their maternal side, they will be descended from the group that was colonized, i.e., from the Neolithic farmers, or in some cases the hunter-gatherer peoples. And so that's what I know about it. And it's a matter of genetics. There was these separate, distinct peoples, and the genetic cluster that is Indo-European seems to center originally around sort of Eastern Europe, around there. And there are certain alleles.
So European civilization is older than Indian civilization? That's the mainstream view?
I didn't mention Indian civilization. I just said that area, the area that is Eastern Europe now, that area. And that's where they came from, and there are certain alleles. I forget the names of them off by heart. For example, the allele that's associated with ginger hair is very strongly associated with this group, and that they seem to have. If I'm under the impression, they spread from east to west, and there's some belief that they spread into India as well, into northern India. There's another name for them other than Indo-European, a sort of Indian-y sounding name. I forget what it is right now, but yeah, that's the model as I understand it, and I'm in no position to criticize it or otherwise. It's not my field.
Well, it is your field because
it's the accepted interpretation of the historical record. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, if it's not your expertise, but you wrote the book on Islam as a group strategy. And it's related, I guess we call Hinduism as a group strategy. Because if you say that Hinduism arose from the indigenous people, ethnic people of India, and so it's genetically their group strategy, just like Islam arose from the Arabic people and could represent a genetic group strategy, the Aryan Invasion Theory implies that Hinduism is not the actual ethnic group strategy of the people there, but came from Aryan invaders who implanted their group strategy on the ethnic people of the Indian subcontinent. And hence Hindus push back and say, no, Hinduism is our group strategy. It's our ethnic historic group strategy. It wasn't the remnants of this Aryan group that conquered us, but it has lots of implications to maybe Dr. Dutton hasn't really studied Hinduism.
No, I don't think I could say I've studied Hinduism to an extent that I can make a comment on that. What I find interesting about to the extent that if we can talk about Hinduism as a group strategy, is the way that the caste system works and what that achieves. So that I find particularly interesting. So if you have a society, what's fascinating about India is the very high level of genetic diversity within India, and even within Indian villages are based along caste lines, due to many centuries of endogamy, leading to the heritability of intelligence, which is of course strongly associated with status, being higher in India than in Western countries. Heritability in Western countries is about 0.8, whereas on Indian samples it's about 0.9. So it's very strongly heritable, because people who are of similar intelligence continuously marry each other endogamously, creating separate castes. So that's very, very interesting. And what it also seems to do is it seems to permit a situation where a society which does not have the environmental conditions, which would, if one of the things which in group selection terms, which allows you to win in the battle of group selection, one of the things is intelligence. So if you're a society that has higher average intelligence, then you may, well, all else being equal, dominate over another society and expand at their expense, because you are better able to, you have more per capita geniuses and you can produce better weapons and warfare and whatever, and so you beat them and you win, or you successfully fend them off, or whatever it happens to be. Now, one way that you can do that, if you have a society which has that does not have conditions which are going to select strongly for intelligence, because it's hot and basic needs are met and there's lots of growing days and whatever, and so the degree of intra-group conflict is lower, is to have a caste system, which would mean that those at the very top would be constantly separated out and ensure that they only married other highly intelligent people. So you would create genius that way. And so therefore you could create a society which had an average IQ which wasn't that high, in the case of India, 80, but within it could be extremely clever people. And I think that's what India has done, and I think that's what the caste system.
You've got it backwards. You seem to think that Varnashrama is what causes higher intelligence, but it's higher intelligence that causes Varnashrama, which is what you're saying is the caste system, but it's actually should be called Varnashrama, which is organizing
Why should
society.
It be called Varnashrama rather?
Well, caste system is something
why
that
should it be
British called it.
So what? I am British. So why would I call it something that isn't British if I am British? The caste system.
Well, do you acknowledge that the British system is also a caste system then?
Sorry?
Do you acknowledge that the British system of governance is also a caste system then?
No, it's not this, because it can be moved out of more easily. So it's not quite the same as a caste system. With a caste system, you have this very strong idea that you intermarry with the person of the same genetic caste. Whereas the British system has always been, although there is a strong tendency for people for like to marry with like, there's a definite social movement within the British system, which would be, although it does happen in India, would be opposed under the rules of the caste system. So I don't see you could say there are other countries that have caste systems. I mean, Nigeria has a caste system, Somalia has a caste system, loads of countries have caste systems, but I'm not sure that
has a caste system. I mean,
no, it doesn't. How you I don't know what you mean. I
all
don't
the
see how
British
Britain
colonies had a caste system where they let the lighter skinned people have more. You know, you have like a white supremacist caste system where the, you know, mixed race natives and whites are higher class than the natives, right? I mean, that's the British style of governance, is it not? I mean, is it not a caste? I mean, even Britain.
Yeah, let's not talk about this right now because I mean I don't necessarily agree, but I wanted to keep the issue. I don't think Dr. Dutton came to talk about in India the caste system. I wanted to keep it focused more on IQ, nature, and a field of research. Although if it's interesting to have this is her main topic, I guess. The Aryan
Well, I
Invasion
wanted to like mention that something you said is along the lines of a theory that I have, which is that all systems of human governance function theocratically. So any type of ideology, you can look at it as a religion because it'll sort of profile as a religion. And I think you said something like that.
I just said Freemasonry when I said it, or in terms of a abstract meta pattern structure of the universal brotherhood of man, that all societies, all people fit into certain pattern behavior, and that will be exhibited by different people in different cultures. But there's these universal patterns, which in my estimation, that's at least the theory of what Freemasonry was trying to do, whether it did it successfully or not. And now from some sort of like scientific approach to anthropology or any of these subjects, where if you could mathematically, scientifically prove that there's these meta patterns, that hierarchical structure, that the caste system is just a manifestation of the same pressures in the same hierarchical structures that manifest in different societies differently, related to different factors. And I mean, that's something that me and Jennifer basically each week just hypothesize on, but we're not formally academics or scientists that would do it in a way that would publish a paper like Dr. Dutton. It's more just hypothesizing or God forbid, just LARPing. but maybe related to issues that you mentioned in your approach to science. And like both of us have, sparred with Jean-Francois Guérepi, and I'm not sure you're not a nihilist, are you? Or are you saying that, would you take that approach like Jean-Francois Guérepi and say that morals and even all societal structures are in fact arbitrary and just choice? And even from that perspective, I mean, me and Jennifer might say it based on spiritual leanings, but even from like, you're not a utilitarian like Stephen Molyneux, and even death and life could be arbitrary, and valuing life over death scientifically is arbitrary.
No, I don't see how you can value if you don't have.
You can't
life,
scientifically say that life is more valuable than death from an intellectual scientific approach, and you say, oh, suffering happened, a person died and suffered. That's not scientifically bad.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was research that I did a very long time ago now, seems like a very, very long, on the concept of implicit religion, which was a theologian called Edward Bailey. And he argued that a lot of people will say that they're not religious and they don't believe in anything metaphysical. But if you actually pursue them, if you actually start sort of breaking down what they're saying, then what is implicit in what they're saying and how they understand the world are certain fundamental beliefs, certain dogmas, even certain metaphysical values, and a certain sort of belief in eternity. And I think that would be that would speak to that concept of what you're saying there. That if somebody says something like that, like, oh, life and death, valuing one over the other is arbitrary, well then, do they live their life like that? Do the way they describe things in other circumstances really imply that that's what they think? They don't necessarily know what they think.
Well, also evidence showing that there may not actually be a correlation between thought and action, which is pretty interesting. Oh, yeah. That it's a different part of the brain that creates narrative when we're asked to explain what we do, versus the area of the brain that's likely to cause our acting when we actually do it.
So with someone like Stephen Molyneux, if he says, oh, there's no value to life or whatever, well, does he live like that? Is that reflected in how he lives? Does he seem to think there's no value to life? Well, clearly not.
Well, it's Jean-Francois Guérepi, I meant, that argued the nihilist school, that morals are preferences. And I argued that even more than he did. The point to say scientifically, there's nothing bad about suffering. You could use science if you took as an axiom, and me and Jennifer put the multiple truth hypothesis, axioms matter, and religious people have different axioms than non-religious people, or even within the realm of science, people have different axioms. But if you take an unscientific axiom like most religions, ahimsa, limitation of suffering, non-aggression principle, you could use the scientific method to try to limit suffering. But in essence, that limiting suffering is a good thing to do is an unscientific idea, and even to conceptually give a value like suffering is bad is beyond the realm of science, and it might even be unscientific, where a scientist has to inform you, I'm sorry to tell you, but suffering is in fact not bad.
I don't think that this is a question for scientists, really. What interests my area that I'm interested in is evolution, and you can talk about the evolutionary benefits to certain kinds of suffering at the individual level and at the group level and whatever, and that's what interests me.
So what about free will in that sense? I mean, you're saying that free will. What's your opinion on free will? What's the how much in the nature and nurture, that how much can a person take out of their own actualization of what I'm calling free will to change their circumstances, and like the chess coach, make better decisions? That there's certain abilities in life where it comes down to a decision, and you could have a high IQ or take low or high birth or come from this race or that race, but people have an intrinsic ability to make good decisions, and that will play a large factor in the outcome of their life.
Yeah, you're asking me about areas that I'm not researching and that and to a certain extent I don't really care about. But my view on free will, I would agree with E.O. Wilson. If we are subject to biological influences on, let's say, personality, intelligence, whatever, and to environmental interaction with these biological influences, then where is there room for this vortex whereby in the moment of doing something, you are independent of those things. And you can stand outside those things and say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do this. I don't see where there is. So I think we would have the illusion of free will. We would feel that we were doing things that were free. But whether they really were free, I think, is highly questionable. And he argues in his book Consilience that no, there is no free will, because there is no space in those two sets of influences for you to be independent of them. And so in that sense, you're not really free. In a sort of philosophical sense of free will. So in that sense, no, I don't believe in free will.
We consider the question largely to be ill-defined, because when we start to ask people, what do you mean by free will, it turns out to be quite difficult to actually ascertain the boundary conditions, like free from what, right? So we can basically establish that we have an impression of free will. And then it's just a question of like, do we accept determinism in terms of like cause and effect? And then there's like the quantum mechanics. Does quantum mechanics leave room for free will? But I think in terms of as an assumption, it's good to just assume it's not there. And if you find it, well, okay, it's there. But if you assume it's there and it's not there, then you're going to be looking for something that's not there, which is no good. And I wanted to come back to this idea about logic and decision making and how people aren't really conscious of their decisions, but then they appear to be driven by some sort of greater logic, or what you call like a meta logic, a biological imperative. But the difference between actually being principled and making, decisions based on an explicitly stated values hierarchy and just acting on impulse and then rationalizing it retrospectively. People tend to do the latter, which is where your assumptions about your motivations are not going to line up with your true motivations, because you're just like, it's a cope basically to not face your dark side when you rationalize post hoc. But you did say that was interesting. I don't know. To me, it's super interesting. So sorry if that's not interesting. I just wanted to bring that up.
The nature of memory is, that's why memory is so unreliable, because people will want to have a perception of themselves in a positive way at any given time, and they will manipulate their memories and possibly even manufacture memories in order to ensure that positive perception of themselves is maintained. And that's one of the problems with history, and it's one of the problems with the nature of testimony. It's one of the reasons why testimony that occurs closer to the time will tend to be more reliable than testimony later, not just because people forget things, but because people reinterpret, it's been argued, every time they remember something. They recompose the memory in their mind in light of how it is adaptive for them to feel about themselves and this memory at a given moment. So the nature of memory is then extremely unreliable.
Are you familiar with the concept of quantum mechanical phenomenon where the act of observation changes that which is observed?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
So that's basically what you're describing right there, is the act of remembering is itself applying compression to the memory. And the compression is subject to the rules of quantum mechanics, so the act of remembering makes the memory worse. So each time, if you want to have an accurate memory, don't remember it. One of these.
If you want to have an accurate memory, then make a note of it as it happens immediately. Because after that, it will degenerate. It will degenerate, and it will become less and less accurate. That's why autobiographies can be so inaccurate, and there can be disputes over it. I don't know how we got onto this, but yes, I would agree with you.
Say one thing about your positive perception, just so that we can maybe bring your idea, because I think we have the same idea, we just express it differently. The way we would say that is that people seek to minimize cognitive dissonance with their self-image. So every time.
I'm perfectly happy to express things in terms of cognitive dissonance. Yes, fine. People seem to. I think it's a very Leon Festinger. I think it's a very useful concept. But yes, people do. That's exactly what people do. And indeed, the studies that Leon Festinger did, he showed it directly that people seemingly alter their memories.
And it matches neurological processes. It was all the various explanatory psychological theories. Cognitive dissonance matches most neurocognitive models of consciousness, and I guess you don't focus that much on cognitive processes in your studies and research.
No, I suppose not.
Yeah, it's interesting from saying the genetic level, but at some point there has to be a cognitive process that occurs, or maybe not, and then okay, maybe we're high IQ people, and like I learned this mostly from listening to Luke Ford, who encouraged me to read this literature, just kept on saying it. All these correlations: high IQ opens with openness, correlates with openness and multiculturalism, and willing to try new things or just be successful. So maybe me and Jennifer both took Eastern leanings, as saying we're in a society that is going through demographic cultural changes, and maybe saying, okay, as a high IQ person, in terms of group strategy, maybe I could adapt my own strategy that's not the group strategy, and I'm on board with multiculturalism or something like that. And then you need new systems to adapt. And I mean, that's what I'm working with, models where you're going to have and I called the name of the show the nature versus nurture and racial differences, that you're going to have a propensity to act in a certain way, and that's largely going to be genetic, but there's an element of what's colloquially called free will and decision-making moments that factually you could speak any language. If you're taught, you might not speak it the same way, and put together ideas. In the new multicultural society, like the majority of English speakers aren't Anglos. And a point I commented on one of your last videos is the computer, the power of the computer to recommend the best strategy. So historically, saying like, okay, I'm going to take this strategy from another culture because their culture is having more success than mine, versus now the elite saying, I'm going to do what the computer recommends, because the computer's recommendation is going to be superior to any strategy that any culture could make. And then it takes high IQ people to be able to have the impulse control and understand and live according to the computer strategy. But then, as Dr. Dutton has made many of these notes, is the Flynn effect in decreasing IQ, and the likelihood of the people that are capable of doing this are the least likely people to reproduce in these societies. I mean, I'm kind of just I'm rambling, but largely these ideas are my ideas mixed with listening to Dr. Dutton. I admit I like your programming and your research, even though I frame it in a more dualistic understanding of explanation.
Yes, it's certainly true that that the top of society, the most intelligent people each generation are boiling off, are not reproducing. And this has been going on since at least 1900, about 1900 in Western countries. There's been a negative correlation between how many children you have and how intelligent you are. And so what you would predict, what happens as a consequence of that, is that the number of per capita innovations, major innovations per million of population per year, however you want to quantify it, is going down. It reached a peak in about 1870, and we have now gone back to where we were in about 1600 in terms of the rate of per capita innovation. So that would imply that we are about as intelligent, as roughly, as people were in about 1600. But however, we live in a much wealthier society. We have far higher standard of living. And so this means that we have sort of capital, really, and a huge amount of capital that's built up, which means we can sustain this extremely complex society with just minor tinkering, mini innovations. And so things will sort of continue to move forward. But as intelligence goes down, then what you would expect is not only macro innovations are falling, micro innovations are falling as well. And eventually we'll get to a point where we're making no new macro innovations. I predict this will happen about 100 years from now. We'll be back to the level of IQ we were at about 1100. And then you will start to find that we can't do things that we used to be able to do. Because if you think about the way that an invention works, you've got a car, let's say, you've got the very, very clever person who invents the car, then you've got the slightly less clever person who develops the car, slightly less clever person who can fix the car, slightly less clever person who can drive the car, and the very unclever person who is cognitively incapable of driving a car. And every generation the top level of the pyramid is boiling off. And so eventually we get down to a level where we just can't do things we used to be able to do. And also the level of trust in complex projects that involve lots of clever people working together will decrease, because you'll get lots and lots of minor mistakes, lots and lots of stupid mistakes being made all the time, everywhere, which means that we're less able, as the society becomes stupider, which means we'll be less able to trust our abilities to not have accidents. And so that's why I think Concorde hasn't got back into the sky, possibly, because we just can't. There's nothing inherently wrong with Concorde. It's just that we have to be able to trust that nobody will make a stupid little mistake.
We didn't press my point of the machine in saying that, like JF's revolutionary phenotype, but that the machine will help interaction between people and say, like, who's going to manage this multicultural mess? And like, well, the computer will. Who's going to prevent the people from making the stupid mistakes that humans make? Well, the computer will. And just say, okay, we might not be able to interact face to face, but with computer facilitated interaction. Or you're saying that, and maybe it's like the caste system, that there has to be, these few people that reproduce, that they could program the computer. Or you're saying that eventually there's going to be no one to program the computer.
That's it, exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. So you're going to, the people that are sufficiently intelligent to be able to program these computers tend not to breed. And so our ability to, and there was a study, I forget what the exact numbers were of this, but it's something like the number of people required to double the speed of technology or something like this, is some measure like this, has decreased since the 70s. And what this is consistent with is us becoming less intelligent, basically. And there are all kinds of other markers that indicate exactly the same thing. Reaction times are getting longer. Color discrimination is getting worse, and we know from data from Iceland that the percentage of the population carrying alleles which are associated with very high IQ has decreased over the last 3 generations. And so what you would expect is eventually that people won't be able to do these things. They won't be able to fix these mega structures that they've made, and then things will start to go backwards. And that's what I would expect to occur.
Yeah, I appreciate you spending time. We didn't necessarily discuss, there's a lot of questions in the chat. I know you have your own big channel and you have Q&As on that. I don't know if it makes sense to just read questions from the chat, or if there's anything that you want to.
I have to get about 10 minutes, but by all means, ask away.
Do you know Claire Caw, the purveyor of secular Quranism, the ethnic Chinese Malaysian attorney in London, who is an alt-right figure and purveying a theory of secular Quranism? Have you heard of her?
No.
Okay, she's a constant streamer. She's kind of interesting. She, despite promoting secular Quranism as some sort of alt-right figure.
I've seen a person called Claire Caw in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So she's here, and she definitely would like to promote your theories. I mean, just because I'm here in Michigan, I went to University of Michigan. I mentioned this book, but you seem to Richard Spencer. This book here, On a Study of Jewish Intelligence and Achievement, 2011, Richard Lynn, is dedicated to Richard Spencer before the rise of the alt-right. This is back in 2011, and then just my personal experience that I never really heard of Richard Spencer till he wanted to come speak at University of Michigan. And to me, it seemed somewhat overreaction that, as I said, like I never saw a reaction like that my whole life. Maybe now with coronavirus but even Black Lives Matters, like a whole student lockout, protests, somewhat rational people, like I'm a Jew. There's a lot of activism in the Jewish community to be worried about these things. And we mentioned the cognitive dissonance, and like Luke Ford talked with Mike Enoch, and Mike Enoch said the media will never. Why did Mike Enoch become Mike Enoch? And he said, like, well, because he's white, and basically that's why why did Richard Spencer become alt-right? And you said, well, the motivating factor is, well, he's white, or there's a greater phenomenon or a pushback to the cultural wars that now it's a few years later, and you have Trump, and I know from people attacking Judaism, the biggest attacks I get generally that I would consider legitimate are related to why are you pushing immigration policies and multiculturalism? Because, pretty fairly I could say, like, yeah, we push multiculturalism and immigration policies, but the pushback from that. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any, I could get catastrophic and like all the trends you're making, like, therefore, there's going to, that's why I'm religious and I believe in the Bible. And unfortunately, Dr. Dutton, what's going to happen is there's going to be a big war and the majority of humanity is going to die. And like, obviously you've written on that type stuff. You have a lot of literature on it. And also before you go, it really seemed like a brilliant concept. I never heard of it till I was preparing for this show, cultural shock. Because, like, I'm a multiculturalist. I promote multiculturalism. I believe it could work. But like, yeah, it's not going to be easy. And it's not like it could be true that it's going to be more difficult on the people who have to bear with multiculturalism. But if there's anything you wanted to add on,
I didn't see how it works. It would work. I mean, if you look at the research by Tatu Vadnen, ethnic conflicts, there's a correlation of 0.66 between how ethnically diverse a country is and how much ethnic conflict there is. So it seems, and this makes a great deal of sense, because people will operate to elevate their inclusive fitness. They will operate in terms of genetic similarity, and therefore they will naturally operate in their own sort of ethnic interests, and they will be more inclined to be with and to trust and to create social goods with and whatever people that are genetically similar to them, with the ethnic group being basically an extended kinship group. A cluster, an extended kinship cluster. And so you're always going to get these kinds of ethnic conflicts. And it's been shown, research by Robert Putnam, that once you get multiculturalism, then what basically happens is social trust collapses. Firstly, between the natives and the ethnic group, they don't trust each other because they're genetically different. And secondly, between the natives, because the natives start to distrust their own members because they are concerned that the natives will collaborate against them with the incomers, which is what you perhaps see in a lot of these countries with left-wing coalitions between left-wing natives and ethnic minorities. So I don't think it's in that sense it's not going to work. The sense in which it works, or it can work, or can be useful, is in terms of trade. Because to put it another way, if you look at the sort of what I call a genius strategy of the English and certain peoples, which is that they're quite low in ethnocentrism, and this allows them to trade, it allows them to expand, and so in that sense they become more multicultural, and then their gene pool gets larger, and they throw out more geniuses, and they have brilliant ideas, and they trade and they expand, and you get this large polity which has these geniuses which then dominate other polities. So there's a positive side to it in that sense, and there's a negative side to it. And I imagine that there must be a sort of an optimum level of genetic diversity, which means that you get the good elements of it, which is more genius, trade, more inventions and whatever, but not the bad elements of it, which is balkanization and general breakdown and collapse of trust and war. And if you're too low in it, then you're just going to get stagnation, really. And if you're too high in it, you get balkanization. And there's probably an optimum place between the two, which is the place to be. And I think that's very difficult to achieve, to know where that will be. And so what you'll tend to get is just swings back and forth between periods of multiculturalism and whatever, and trade and internationalization, and then which will also probably correlate with high levels of societal achievement, high intelligence, high civilization, and then the collapse of these back into highly ethnocentric, inward-looking, separated, warring societies. And that'll swing back and forth throughout history. And that's what you, I think, seem to get.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about, said I never really heard of the Frankfurt School until I encountered, the alt-right. And then, I'm a product of the Frankfurt School. And even thinking, historically, that there would be this German Jewish woman who was a student of Anna Freud and comes to Michigan and recruits high IQ people to educate them according to Freudian and Frankfurt School teachings and promote multiculturalism and immigration in order to, God forbid, prevent fascism in the next Holocaust, versus like a pushback that there might be an explanatory reason why it makes sense that Freud trained this woman and she ended up in Detroit, and the school ended up training me and putting me into a mindset versus opposition. Like does it have to be World War III catastrophic in order to balance these forces, or is there some method that like the founders of the school I went to, like let's recruit high IQ people and train them in Frankfurt thinking in order that they could push society in a certain direction, or a pushback that you're saying, like no, it's that Frankfurt teaching that's ruining society.
Yes, the societies always seem to operate in these ways. If you read Sir John Glubb's book on the decline of civilizations, they always operate in these ways. They reach a high point and then they become decadent. They lose their martial values. They start to question their religiousness and because the level of religion is associated with mortality salience. Mortality salience goes down. They start to question their religiousness. They therefore lose their sort of monumentalist values. They stop having children. They stop believing in anything. They stop believing their own society is superior, as undergirded by a belief that the gods think this. They stop believing in patriarchy, which is something which is rendered the will of God by the religion. So you get feminism, so you get multiculturalism, so you get ethnic strife, so you get materialism, you get individualism, and then the society is eclipsed by a society which is basically more group selected and higher in these martial values. And I think that's kind of what's happening now. And I think that's what happened towards the end of Rome and towards the end of Greece and towards the end of Baghdad. And it's documented exactly. It's exactly the same every time. Exactly the same things happen every time, like to the letter. Even feminism you had in Baghdad.
We're saying motivation that, in theory, from a religious point of view, altruism. So maybe evolutionary, it makes sense that German Jewish refugees would come to America and try to select high IQ people in order to promote ideas, in order that a Holocaust doesn't happen again, or society is directed in a way that suffering and this calamity wouldn't fall to it again. And then like there's a Twilight episode with Rod Serling, he was a Talmudic scholar himself, where the person trying to stop what they were trying to stop actually going back in time fatedly causes it, versus some sort of like Hindu idealization of sages who are given God-given talent, standing up on their own, not necessarily through some selective training of one nation or another nation or group trying to gain a footing or direct society, but some sort of altruistic. But there doesn't seem to be. Luke Ford claimed, Kyle claimed that there was correlations between IQ and altruism.
There is weak.
Yeah, but it wouldn't seem the case. And even if there would be such that organized, like, Ed could be like, I figured it out. All I have to do is recruit all the high IQ people and convince them, and say like, no, unfortunately, the power of humanity is limited, and we might be able to recognize these trends. But in reality, to change these trends is very, what could we do besides have an internet conversation? I'm glad you are. And like Jennifer said, these conversations are, from my view, the more important ones to move society forward than what's usually talking.
Okay, well, I'm afraid I have to be off.
Can I just say one last thing before you go? It's not a question, but thank you so much for joining. I think your research is interesting. Not sure I agree 100% with the interpretation, but I think it's a good vector to explore. Are you familiar with the 100th monkey effect?
No.
Super interesting study that might help to substantiate your theory in terms of how the information spreads within the population that would seem to be required for your theory to work. So that was all I had to say, and it was great to meet you, and thanks again for coming on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Maybe I'll ramble for a few minutes if you don't mind. Just try to wrap up your research and connect it to mine. Or if you want, I could end the stream now. Did you have anything you wanted to say to me?
No, it was a pleasure to talk to you both. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Oh, yeah, I really appreciate you having on. And I appreciate Yehuda Finkelstein for making this happen. And I'm a controversial guy. I don't stray from controversy. I have my own opinions. I like Dr. Dutton's work. He explains a lot of phenomenon in a way that's informative to me, like a greater worldview, how you look at the view, nihilism. He doesn't have to explain that. Like, I didn't press him on his own personal beliefs. I was more interested in his research. And anyone who follows Doooovid regularly, me and Jennifer are more on a cognitive decision level analysis of why things happen, why people act in the way they do. So Dr. Dutton, on an anthropological level, we talk a lot of anthropology, but that's not our expertise. And even, cognitive neuroscience or evolutionary. I forgot to ask him about Professor Nowick, Jeffrey Epstein's cognitive evolutionary psychologist at Harvard that I quote from. But in terms of my own research and what I'm advancing, I plan on drawing on a lot of the research of Dr. Dutton, although I have a different explanation. I am, in essence, a dualist. And, so we'll see if that goes anywhere. Like I would, I'm open for debate. That's why I'm here. I love Judaism. If people want to see like a JQ debate, I would have done it, or a talk on any of these issues. This was just kind of like a random guy that supports the channel. So talk to Doooovid. I'm glad we spoke. And, Dr. Dutton probably never heard of me before. I'm a small-time streamer, but I've read his research and paperwork. Stephen Campbell, $5. Thanks for having Dutton on. It was great to see such a conversation. Nature of trolling, internet debates. And like I told Jennifer, like the essential scholarship that I want to advance is going to be in the academic format that is going to be accepted in academia, although like Dr. Dutton has a popular YouTube channel and information that's valuable for people on all levels. I think there was a little bit of a disconnect. Jennifer came late. We didn't have a chance to telegraph the stream, and even Dr. Dutton, he didn't want to do it that way. I would have telegraphed it almost, and what are we going to talk about in time? So it was kind of by air, and then I guess Jennifer came on late, and he didn't really have anything to say about Aryan Invasion Theory, or you see a level of expertise where that's why I have the multiple truth hypothesis, where different people have different bits of information, but they're based on different axioms, and those will cause cooperation to fail because the axioms predict different conclusions, and those conclusions differ enough to cause conflict. And so when you have two different people that have different axioms, there's going to be conflict, but the only way to make progress is to work together despite different axioms. And Freemasonry is a hypothetical thing, like the Queen's Gambit, like Jennifer in the Queen's Gambit movie. At some point, she gets to the level, she's almost national champion, and then she has to study from the books. She has to learn a professional manner in order to compete on the higher level. So me and Jennifer, that's why I sing the research. You have to know the terminology and what's being discussed in the halls of academia, and to the masses, they might not know or care or be little advantage to doing this, but hopefully I'm going to try to put in the work. Hopefully Jennifer will also, but I think it was a little bit of a disconnect. I mean, did you feel that like a disconnect, like the way that you and Dutton spoke, it didn't phase in right away? And I think it was, axioms, probably maybe just because you came late, that we didn't have a chance to kind of formalize axioms, which I'm very careful to do. Even the best streamers, JF, Stephen Molyneux, Sam Harris, even to a tiny extent, don't really go through the process of formalizing axioms in order to have a productive conversation.
Well, it would take a really long time to formalize axioms, don't you think? Like, for how long did it take for you and I to have like axiomatic bilingualism? It didn't happen right away.
Yeah, but saying me and you have been talking for years, we've already done that process. So Dutton and you could have formalized, I mean, both of you are smart enough that you could have formalized axioms had you had a good moderator and wanted.
He did state his axioms. He said he cared about truth no matter what, and that science was all about truth. He did state those axioms. So
Yeah.
that's like what most people who claim to be objective will claim, but it's obviously not true, which was instantly made clear by the Aryan Invasion Theory and his knowledge of India. He seems to know more about India than Britain, which I find ironic. India has a caste system, but Britain doesn't. It's like, well...
Yeah, but it's saying you didn't clarify your axioms for that to make sense, where it's very likely that he didn't understand what you're saying.
Well, I don't understand what he says when he says it's a caste system that's based on racial non-mixing when it's based on occupation, like marrying someone of the same vocation. So his axioms on basically anything to do with India are incorrect. So yeah, of course there's going to be a disagreement.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying he straight up said he didn't know much about that. And that, I told him basically everything we planned on talking about.
Right? He says he doesn't know a lot about it, but he's certain that India has or had.
I'm not a surprise guy. Like, I told him everything I planned on asking about. I didn't say, if I was going to ask him about the Aryan Invasion Theory, I would have told him beforehand. I wasn't like trying to got you. Like, here's a question on the Aryan Invasion Theory. I was very clear on the things I wanted to talk about beforehand.
I don't think it was controversial, the Aryan Invasion Theory. He just said what it was, and he said he didn't know if he didn't have an opinion on it, and I said that was fine. I think the controversy happened when we were talking about India.
Yeah, and if that's interesting for you and him to set up a conversation or debate or Claire, I mean, he's a professor, and
I create too much cognitive dissonance largely to talk to these types. I have more luck with hobbyists because can you imagine?
Yeah, I'm saying
knowing more about the subject,
failure.
you spent your whole life. Well, dude, but imagine you spent your whole life devoted to one subject, and someone came along, knew more about it than you did, who hadn't studied that subject.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy that. I mean, it's kind of, and even the cognitive.
It's happened to me so many times in my life. You're saying every time it happened, it was a different cause. It's happened hundreds of times.
Well, you have explanation for behavior and that's why the multiple truth hypothesis. There's obviously an infinite explanations for behavior, and humankind's ability to decipher the correct explanation causation is limited. But the system per force that people need to function in society or even just live and not die from the natural elements necessitates patterns, and those patterns will cause cognitive dissonance. And the sense of another person who understands patterns better than them causing cognitive dissonance is unclear. The mechanism. You say
not for you, Doooovid, because your identity doesn't turn on. That is his vocation. He is a professor. You're like me, basically. You're a hobbyist. You love it. So we talk and it's like, yay, we can share this thing that we love together. It doesn't threaten your self-image to have me be.
Well, no, I don't call it. You call it like you put in a pejorative, but I just say like, no, you got to pay.
I'm not making a moral judgment.
Like
you need to just acknowledge the argument on its merit.
No, you got to pay. He does it professionally, and it's like a chess player. Like you say, like, oh, like I'm a professional chess player. I make money at it. You're not good enough, and so like a professor is like, I'm a professional intellectual. I get paid. You call yourself an amateur. You could have your reasons for why you think you know right and wrong, but as of now, like he gets paid, we don't. And whether that causes dissonance or not, that's not how I would look at the motivating factor. Although, I mean, obviously you could have a theory and you're welcome to have your theory of the motivations of what's causing people to act in the way they do. And that's why I find Dutton interesting, because he's proposing his own correlations and theories for why people act the way they do. And the cognitive dissonance as a model to explain all human behavior, and then a question of ideas and people. How do other people or ideas, and is the cognitive dissonance always there? And someone else is, okay, I had like a chess thing. I didn't realize I sucked at chess until I played someone who beat me easily. So the cognitive dissonance came from losing, and until I lost and didn't know that my understandings of the patterns were not that good, it didn't bother me. But now this other person came by and demonstrated that my understanding of the patterns were weak and just easily beat me. That's a form of cognitive dissonance, but you actually have to go through the game and win to cause that dissonance. Or if you want to say from some metaphysical level, you could just sense this person understands more profoundly and it's causing me dissonance, versus the question in the first place is maybe the dissonance is there in totality. You don't have to lose for the dissonance to be there. You know there's a factual element of how well you understand the world and the patterns, and the dissonance exists whether other people demonstrate that or not. It's just like being poor. If you only have a certain amount of money, you're saying knowing that there's other people who have more money, is that what causes the dissonance? Or is the dissonance going to be there whether you know there's more people with more stuff out there or not?
No, it's all to whether it causes cognitive dissonance with your self-image. So for you, my brilliance doesn't cause cognitive dissonance with your self-image because you have no forbiddance on the existence of someone like me in your cognitive matrix. So it wouldn't cause cognitive dissonance. Whereas with other people, you could see why it would, because it would be like having a 3-year-old beat you in chess who had never played chess before. How would that make you feel?
Well, it's a question of feel. So, okay, if a person's a sociopath, it's not going to make him feel any way in the first, or it's a question of ego.
Well, most people aren't sociopaths. Most people have feelings, and the strongest feelings that get aroused have to do with cognitive dissonance with the self-image.
Yeah, so the explanatory behavior from a Judeo-Freudian system of ego, id, superego, or a Hindu system versus a mechanistic understanding of brain patterns versus like a multiple truth hypothesis that's trying to work with these multiple theories, even though they conflict with each other because there's no common axioms. And Professor Dutton even had a paper on the social sciences towards the science. I mean, he's got towards the scientific model of cultural shock and intercultural communication. And I think it was a different paper that mentions trying to come up with common axioms among the social sciences, that as of now, there are not common axioms among the social sciences, and it's problematic. And it could be it's impossible that in reality, if you demanded, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem extension, that if you demanded common axioms among the social sciences, all you would do was disprove the scientificness of the social sciences.
Well, you disprove the scientificness of the axioms, and they are pretty much all using the same axiom. And that's why they don't have scientific credibility, because the axioms cause conclusions that are absurd or contradict the predictions.
Yeah, I guess it goes back also to what, like, JF's nihilism is weaker than Doooovid's form of nihilism, because you say the recognition of the conclusion of JF is that there is no morals. It doesn't, suffering is not objectively bad. Death is not objectively bad. And
I just don't see how one follows from the other, because they're not, what's the, like, I don't even understand what definition they're using for morality.
I think he missed my question, but I'm saying for JF's version of nihilism, and I'm not sure if Dutton just misunderstood my question or he kind of danced around it, and then it looked like he confused what I thought JF's position and Molyneux's question. So I have to watch back and see if we talked past each other, or if he said something I didn't understand it, or a miscommunication. But from a religious axiom level, to say Doooovid knows I'm a speck of nothing, I don't matter. I believe that there's truth out there, and there could be any form that the creator could choose to deliver that truth in. So the most general forms as a religious person is scripture. If you're a Hindu, the Vedas. As a Jew, it's the Torah, the prophets, the sages. But there's other, everything is a message of the creator, and the creator could use any given method to convey truth. So if a person, Jennifer, is coming to me, I have wisdom that's valuable to you, and I don't have to explain to you how I have that wisdom, like quantum mind. And it was like, I never heard of quantum mind. And then she could demonstrate that to me. And okay, scientifically, so where did that wisdom come from? And she's going to give her own explanation that would appear to be non-scientific. But from Doooovid's point of view, okay, unless she's claiming to be, like a prophet or a false prophet, or guiding people, in the ways that are ruled against in the Vedas or the Torah, that, God forbid. But just that there would exist wisdom someplace from an unexplainable source, that does not surprise Doooovid, even though generally I look for wisdom in the most expected places, like university, books, academics. But it does not surprise me, like King Solomon, the wise man learns more from the fool, and God has weird ways of working. And so I expect to find wisdom everywhere. And I'm not surprised to find wisdom in unexpected sources, or even the truth to a matter that other people could not answer. In fact, I have theories about autistic people. And, I brought Professor Dutton on for IQ, and he hadn't, it'd be more interesting, a more formalized academic study. But, like the fact that autistic people, idiot savants, can be chess champions, and purveyors of information, or certain Kabbalistic mystical theories that people born with cerebral palsy are the reincarnations of great sages. And I didn't even get a chance to ask Professor Dutton about reincarnation, but chances are he probably wouldn't have wanted to talk about it. And I wouldn't be surprised. Like, he said he studied theology. He probably, Professor Dutton probably has theological beliefs that he didn't want to share. It's hard to imagine he would have, studied theology so much without. What was your take on the interview? Compare the karma of Dia, Latina, who came on Week in Review, who this guy Reviler, who let's say is a pretty unpleasant character, who somehow sets me up to be interviewed on an Australian program, Dia. That we'll say is a negative karma. This guy Reviler generally has historically been affiliated with negative association, but somehow possibly something good could come from that. Versus, Yehuda Finkelstein, no idea. He supports this guy Dutton. Maybe I know him, maybe I don't. And he says, talk to me. So I don't know what he wanted from it. Interesting. What do you take of the karma of this interaction?
Well, I don't know much about his religious views. I just remember he had a chat about religion being a positive contributor to survival strategy. I don't think he worded it exactly like that, but that it improves group cohesion. Like, he was listing all the ways in which religion helps with survival.
Well, I'm just assuming he would have rejected reincarnation from that.
Well, the logical opinion is that reincarnation should be accepted because it's what gives people the longest time purview, which is what allows for the most planning for the future. But to get people to agree with that logic is very difficult because the amount of cognitive dissonance it causes. So yeah, it's probably good not to get into that on this stream.
Well, you want to portray, allow a person to give over their expertise without ruining it by confronting them on issues you disagree about. And obviously, Dutton self-proclaims to be an expert in controversy, so it wasn't, unlikely. But he is a scientist, and I felt at a certain realm, it was unclear. What do you make of the general interaction, the karma of whoever this guy Yehuda Finkelstein, who supports some of his work, recommending we talk, and then just our talk, how we met and what we talked about? What does it mean? Is it going anywhere? In the larger picture, that he streams with Richard Spencer, who was the biggest boogeyman in my Michigan history.
Well, I guess the karmic bottleneck is with him. Like, does he want to? Is his desire to learn something larger than his desire to be perceived as the smartest person in the room? And no offense to him, I get it. This just intellectuals are this way.
Well, was he here to preach to us, or was he here to be preached to, or was he here because we're supposed to collaborate on work? Or was it was supposed to be like a blood source beatdown that only one of us could move forward because the ideas are one side has to win.
Well, that was unclear, but the vibe I got was that he was expecting to be asked questions about his theories.
And I guess it shows the academia of what you're saying. Like, he's here because the person who pays him to do to support his work told him to talk to me, which is. I guess I will. No, it's your message. Yeah, so in streaming debates, Dutton's a smart guy. He's survived internet censorship. He does his YouTube streaming and takes it down. He's not really like a hate speech guy. Like, he's a scientist. He's a friendly guy. I never met the guy. We had a friendly conversation. I would have a feeling like we could probably hang out in Detroit. Like I don't think like I'm sure Dutton could come to Detroit and I could introduce him to a bunch of African Americans, and like he would probably be able to successfully do that despite the some of his research and theories he's advancing. He defended his himself and what he thinks and why he's doing what he's doing. But then he's an academic. Me and Jennifer are not academic. I'm a landlord, engineer by profession, a theologian. I'm preaching spiritual things, and we don't get paid. We reject the ability of getting paid for our wisdom. I got a few super chats. Maybe I'll use that towards computer equipment or providing better streaming. But yeah, it makes a difference in the fact, and even like from Dutton's dissonance perspective, like why is he talking to Doooovid? Because someone paid him to, as opposed to, and so why is he getting paid? Is he getting paid because he's supposed to learn from me and you, or because whoever paid him wants him to teach me and you something because they think that he's got something useful to teach us? Or is it like a Brundle, Luke Ford, just for better streaming, and we're going to get bigger viewers and move on to bigger, better things, because we did that. And so multiple truth hypothesis, Newton holding different ideas in your head at the same time. I like that kind of thing. Jennifer likes that kind of thing. That's why we do good streaming. Long term, like what sense would cooperate with Dutton in a theory, like he's came up with examples to incorporate. I don't know, and just like the streaming, like a general form. I mean, it definitely is a good find. He's a big streamer. Got 50 people watching now. It's way more than I ever get. So that's almost exclusively due to Professor Dutton and his following. Where are you taking this, Jennifer? I know where I'm gonna. I've already.
Well, he at one point something he said sort of stuck with me, and he said, "Well, it's not up to scientists to answer this question." I can't even remember what the question was, but do you remember when he said that?
Well, on suffering being good or bad.
Right. So it's like, well, what luck have the non-scientists had answering any of these metaphysical questions? Answer: none. And though there's no guarantee science can provide the answer, it can at least minimize the huge degree of error that's currently present in the field. So that comment seemed like he wasn't really interested in going deeper into the science. Because, if you want to become a good scientist, you do have to learn logic at a very high strategic level, and that requires you to be in a learner mindset. And a person who thinks they already know everything, this isn't about him in particular, it's just generally a trend, can't learn. They're just going to double down on their existing beliefs and get more antagonized if you don't cede to their ego.
Yeah, that's it. From a scientific perspective, you're saying the question of free will is probably the most important because it is determinative processes, or is there some sort of decision-making process involved?
More important than free will. Consciousness is the central question of science, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but consciousness and free will are interdependent. And it's saying the question, presumably, the solution to the hard problem of consciousness will definitively answer whether free will exists or not. In all of these type things where we debate,
it, right? We can't know if it's real if we haven't defined it, right? Because we have like an emotional idea of what free will is, but if you actually go to define it with other words than free and will, like how do you say what you're trying to say? The ability to control your own destiny.
Well, but you hypothesize ego, and I'm saying ego is a non-scientific concept, and presumably your theories are going to be false in the direction of scientific research, because the direction of scientific research will show that there is no conceptual ego that overrides or directs people to act in a certain way. It's just a conglomeration of pattern recognition, and there is no overriding ego process. So you're looking at the Vedas or Kabbalistic wisdom or personal reflection to assume that there's some sort of ego process, as where the direction of science would say, forget about the concept of the ego, and the ego itself is related to free will explanation. So even you yourself who claim to be against free will when you talk about the concept of ego, that the ego is essentially a concept of free will, and the actual explanations that science is leading to explain consciousness will show that there actually is no ego, there is no free will, there is no decision-making processes.
Well, if science is going to say that the consciousness doesn't make decisions and that it doesn't have a personality, those scientists are going to be discredited because it contradicts literally everybody's experiences. So
Well,
it's
it's
not
just saying that consciousness is an illusion. That's why I say my predictions predict
nobody's
that no
going to
one's
be
going to
able
listen
to
to
say.
me.
You're I mean, you're taking the position that you don't want to take. You're saying consciousness has no energy in it. You're saying consciousness doesn't exist.
I'm advancing my own theories of dualism. So my purpose is, I mean, for an intellectual experiment and just, taking ideas to their natural conclusion, that's what we do. But I mean, obviously Doooovid is using people like JF and Dr. Dutton largely for the purpose of arguing for dualism, and that the essential flaw of JF and Dutton is their failure to recognize the spiritual realm. So I mean, that's the larger purpose in these debates, and I'm essentially arguing against people like Luke Ford and saying you're a fence sitter. God exists. What we pray to, these forces do not arise from the material realm. They arise from a spiritual realm. And if you're sitting on the fence like that to show that that on the material side is evolution, and evolution is a fault, so it kind of comes back to discrediting evolution. And you're saying like, no, I don't agree with Dr. Dutton. And you're saying, well, if evolution is true, Dr. Dutton is the natural conclusion. JF is the natural conclusion. If evolution is true, we are not going to beat coronavirus. Any idiot who thinks that we're about to beat coronavirus does not understand evolution. And however you want to look at it. And so Doooovid and Jennifer both agree in kind of the IQ studies like chess, like why no one likes Queen's Gambit. Because me and Jennifer agree about what most other people disagree about. And then we disagree about things that most people, you could say in pejorative, don't understand but don't care about. And maybe they don't care about it because they don't understand. And then you could look at a cognitive process. Why don't people care about it? Why don't they understand it? And looking like the chess studies of expertise, because it takes thousands of hours of research and meditation to build up. And because that model, intrinsically, I reject Jennifer's self-explanatory power, because it's the sages say, if someone says they worked and didn't achieve, don't believe them. Said they achieved without working, don't believe them. It is impossible that Jennifer achieved without working. It goes against the principles of the sages. So if she gives some sort of explanation that somehow she achieved without working, I'm going to dismiss that because it goes against the fundamental axiom. Although because of the multiple truth hypothesis, I could see that there's a different axiomatic system that could be true despite my axiomatic system forcefully negating such a claim.
Well, I did do a lot of work. I had to teach myself all this quantum mechanics stuff and math. I mean, I did have some teachers and it was very helpful, but I mean, I don't see how. I'm not saying I just got something plopped out of nothing.
Or you say it's a Mayavadi conspiracy. It's like, I know because
I didn't say it's a Mayavadi conspiracy.
I'm God. I know all these things.
I didn't say that.
Yeah. So, okay. So people can tune in for a week in review. I guess I appreciate people tuning in. I want to continue with my chess studies. Do you want to make any concluding remarks? And then maybe I'll ramble just how I'm going to try to tie this in with my chess and multiple truth hypothesis. I'll let Jennifer say any concluding thoughts or remarks.
Yeah, awesome. It was great to talk to the doctor, and I hope everybody can become a scientist, no matter what their field of study is, because it'll give way better results. And thanks for having me on. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. And there's thinking from the Dutton level, do I hope everyone could become a scientist, or show that people need a proclivity towards it, and that not everybody should? It's like, do I want everyone to play chess? Or it's like, no, just the people have a proclivity towards it, and making a better world from understanding if that's possible. So say, okay, because I want to frame things in a narrative that I'm accomplishing something, and versus the scientific truth, like I mentioned on the show, that the evidence showing that the narrative people give to explain why we do things comes from a different part of the brain from the parts that actually seem to cause us to do things, and that it's possible that there's not actually a connection between the narrative we use to explain why we do things and why we actually do things from a scientific level, that when you ask a person why they do something, that they're not going to give you the real reason. It's these deterministic processes, and it's just a center of the brain that creates narratives or these different things. So I'm trying to use chess, because that's what I do, to show the line of research and actually, create a real theory. Dr. Dutton's a real academic. He's got hundreds of papers. Doooovid has 0 papers. So, multiple truth hypothesis, I could advance it, formalize it in a formal language. Jennifer obviously has a blog. No, those are, professional academic peer-reviewed papers, but, she's actually written hundreds of articles, and appreciate that. Whoever hooked me up with Dr. Dutton, I appreciate it. It's interesting, Richard Spencer, the first show of Brundle, where he got the number, and I mentioned University of Michigan, and even till today, the question of these issues, they're important, and I still support immigration, multiculturalism, universal brotherhood of man, but proclivities, differences between nature and nurture, interracial differences, Manic, or change his name so many times. My first guest for a sit down from Luke Ford, and we say gave that speech on the common phrase that there's more differences within races than between races. But obviously there's differences. People are different. We speak different languages. We look different. We have different proclivities, the level of free will, and to actually create mechanisms of a scientific level that I think I've demonstrated the current level of science, what is known, versus the type of level of understanding that would be necessary to actually propose answers. And I mentioned like the differential equations that Dr. Dutton has mentioned a bunch of things and trends, and a lot of them seem true, but to work out a full model of civilization that would be, some unsolvable series of differential equations that has some factor, or even the idea that, maybe you could create a computer or a machine that would do it, and the implications of the trends. Because, obviously science, you say, okay, that's an interesting trend, Dr. Dutton, I seem to agree, but what about the implications? Okay, the Flynn effect, are we going to keep on decreasing in IQ? Are we not going to figure out how to program the computer? All these various things, or the issues of, is it fated, God forbid, that, like Jennifer said, that no, unfortunately, I can't convince people to like science. You can't just make the world a better place. Maybe it's fated in a, God forbid, karmatic way that forces balance out, and the way that they balance out is through war, death, suffering, and bloodletting, as maybe the Kabbalist or Vedic or spiritual scholars weighed these things out in a way from the God's eye view as opposed to the man's eye view, and utilitarianism, and you're saying you don't have to have a consistent, coherent worldview. You say, okay, Professor Dutton, does he have a consistent, coherent worldview? And it doesn't mean that his research isn't valid or that he hasn't contributed a lot, even if he hasn't came up with a consistent, coherent worldview. And from Gödel's incompleteness theorem, of course, there is no such thing as a consistent, coherent worldview. And that's part of the idea behind the multiple truth hypothesis, is working with the knowledge that you can't actually form a single consistent, coherent worldview. And there's going to be different ones with different axioms and different implications. So I guess with that, I'm not going to ramble too much. I appreciate the higher viewership. Definitely appreciate Jutta Finkelstein for setting this up, and Dr. Dutton for coming on my channel, and Jennifer, as always, for hosting Week in Review, and for being my study partner in these things and keeping streaming going, and meeting new personalities. I'd like to keep on talking to new people. I'd like to advance my research, and people who have similar ideas to try to bring us together, because obviously there was another area like expertise that was related to Dutton studies. He's done so much stuff, just to ask him about all of it. But the level of skill differential for expertise, where you can't really have a Renaissance man who's really good at different things. You have to spend your lifetime specializing in one small narrow field to advance it, and that's greater effect on humanity and in social cohesion. The advantage of diversity and multiculturalism is that it's likely that it's going to be different cultures and different people from different diverse backgrounds that devise solutions to different questions. And can those people work together? And and the bias of doing that, would it be a natural altruistic process if it's like a Hebraic coming of Messiah and the sages, or is it just submit and human nature is flawed and kind of like a Kabbalistic Talmudic understanding, unguided by divine providence? The nature of man, unfortunately, is to rise up and kill each other and do bad things. That the flesh directs, God forbid, murder, rape, steal. That the flesh naturally causes a person to desire to do the most horrific things, and only through some sort of divine external process can cohesion come. Even a Judeo view of the Jews as priests to nations, that conflict is in fact the natural order between nations, and the Jewish people as a divine priestly class to nations to cause cohesion between nations, as the hypothesis of the classical Jewish religion. And I'm not expecting that Dr. Dutton would accept the axioms of classical Judaism, but even in that, is social cohesion possible? Do the great minds and these various things? So I guess I'll conclude that with my ramble, and appreciate Jennifer, Dr. Dutton, Jutta Finkelstein, Luke Ford, John Francis, all the streamers. And I'd rather, like Dia was saying, like she's trying to get, she's having difficulty getting an African-American to interview. I mean, I live in Detroit. Like I'm talking to I guess called whites, but like I don't, I live around mostly African-Americans and Jews. That's who I deal with on a regular basis. But the power of the internet, so to have these conversations and hopefully it'll lead somewhere good. So blessing, shalom, take care.